I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we stand today to kick off the Q&A series webinar of Australian Science Communicators. Welcome, Jonathan Webb. I'll just quickly introduce myself. So my name is Astha Singh. I'm the president of the New South Wales Australian Science Communicators branch. I worked across a whole range of STEM domains, including science communication programs and platforms such as Sydney Science Festival, National Science Week, TEDx Sydney, Fame Lab, Soapbox Science, and currently I am serving as the STEM ambassador for the India-Australia Business and Community Awards. And we have got with us today the lovely Jonathan Webb, who is the ABC Science editor. Jonathan is a lapsed neuroscientist and a former science reporter for the BBC News. He is now running a unit at ABC that makes specialist science and health content across radio, podcast, and the web. Previously, Jonathan was a science reporter for BBC News, covering science stories for the website, radio, and TV. He started at the BBC on a bursary in the early 2014 after completing a PhD in neuroscience at the University of Oxford. We can follow Jonathan on Twitter at JJBW and myself at Astha Singh. Excellent. So I just wanted to start with a question from my end. What is the overall mission of the ABC Science Unit, Jonathan?
That's a really good question. And it's kind of hard to put into a nutshell, I think, because we've thought a lot about what our role should be. And there's been a few changes already in the time since I've been here. And there's kind of lots of elements to what we do. The most important one is providing, quality, specialist, trustworthy content, stories on science and health and related issues for Australians. And I think an important part of that these days is doing that in a way that's accessible for as many Australians as possible. So that'll include our traditional broadcast outputs, but it'll also include social media and trying to reach audiences that maybe don't get to the ABC otherwise. So my digital team works hard on all that sort of stuff. And we set up a fresh Instagram account just in the last couple of months, because you will have noticed there's a pandemic going on. There's more of a need for health info than ever. So ABC Health now has a presence on Instagram. So being that sort of source of stories and information for Australians is a good one. But I think we also like to do what we can to kind of represent Australian science to the world. It's not really a core charter responsibility of the ABCs necessarily to reach audiences overseas, although there have been ebbs and flows, I think, in the emphasis that the government through the ABC puts on that kind of overseas broadcasting, type activity. Used to be bigger, it's currently a bit smaller. It looks like they might be wanting to invest in it a bit more again now. We'll see what happens. But some of our podcasts obviously reach quite far overseas. Some of our online content gets read a lot overseas. I'd like to see that as part of what we do, kind of represent the best of what's going on in Australia from people who find it on our platforms. But a really important thing that maybe could take all of our time, but I think it's an important job and I don't want to let go of it as a responsibility, even though it can take quite a lot of time, is being a science brains trust for the ABC, because there's lots of other bits of the ABC that tell all sorts of different types of stories, and a lot of those touch on science at various times, whether it's climate change or the virus or whatever it might be. It might be news, or it might be big documentaries, or all sorts of things. And having a group of people with the kind of knowledge that my team has, all in, with particular strengths in different bits of science, but just in science and in research generally and how it works, is really valuable for the ABC and can kind of help us not stuff up and get things wrong on big issues, and can also just lift the quality of what we're doing if they can run it past a specialist and make sure that there aren't any slip-ups, or that they're not missing a big question or something in there. So those are kind of three things I'd say are all part of our mission. apart from just, cracking science stories to as many people as who will listen.
Yeah, that's a lot of great quality work, making a huge impact on the entire nation. So congratulations. Going back a couple of months, Jonathan, all things coronavirus. What happened when COVID-19 hit us? What happened when it was coronavirus all the time? How did the other science coverage fit into the whole scheme of things, which were COVID-19?
We had a bit of a mix, but obviously a lot of what we were doing became all about the virus, and that was the right thing to do. Everyone was coming to the ABC to know what was going on. Our numbers went through the roof in all sorts of ways. I think we don't know all about the actual sort of broadcast ratings, but there was certainly some sort of a lift there, and I think radio ratings have sort of been paused now for a while. But in the digital space, where we can get really good numbers, the ABC News website suddenly rose to the top of the chart in Australia, and it's been there ever since. But during that key month of kind of late March and going into April, it wasn't just number one, it was number one by several million readers. And that's where my digital team in particular published their stories, and they were a really key part of putting explainers up there and putting in-depth kind of features that were answering the questions that we could see people were asking on Google. So we didn't drop everything, but we dropped a lot to concentrate on coronavirus, especially in the digital space. We also started a new podcast, which went straight to the top of the charts in collaboration with ABC News. I should give credit where credit's due. The producer of Coronacast, our sort of coronavirus dedicated podcast, comes from the news division, and it's done with Norman Swan and Tegan Taylor, who both come from my team. And that has been a huge success, still going. Interestingly, has started to have a bit of a resurgence. The numbers have been really strong all the way along, but they were starting to dip. And then at the same time as the infection rate started to increase in Victoria, the download numbers have started going up again. You can almost plot them on a graph and ask questions about correlation and causation. So lots of extra effort. And then in terms of regular ongoing programs, obviously things like the health report became all about coronavirus for quite a period, and still are to some extent. And then with other shows like All in the Mind or the Science Show, we sometimes tried to just do something different, because if you were paying attention to the news, it was hard to hear anything that wasn't pandemic related. So I know Robin made a point of doing some quite different things on the Science Show, and All in the Mind often kind of took a slightly tangential approach. I think there was a lovely show on there early on in the pandemic about contagious ideas or something. It was just a really interesting sort of tangent that felt relevant, but wasn't more of the same. So it was a bit of a mix. Yeah.
Sounds very, very hectic to me.
It was that. Because of course we all had to get, like all of us have, we all had to get used to working from home at the same time.
Do you get a lot of engagement with people trying to write questions, emails, queries about the vaccine that is supposed to be developed in the rest of the world and in Australia? Did you?
Yeah, we got questions about the vaccine. We got questions about treatments. We got questions about hygiene and dealing with the virus. And this was, again, together with the news division and news digital, ran a big kind of question system that you could get to from, I think we had a abc.net.au/coronavirus URL. You could find everything, and you could also ask questions. And we got thousands, which were really useful for the Coronacast podcast, but we answered a lot of them with sort of written explainers as well. And they use a system called Harken for that, which is quite a sophisticated system for kind of pooling and grouping questions, and it allows you to kind of dig in and try and identify the common themes. And that there was actually a couple of people in news dedicated to dealing with that huge influx of questions, and then distributing kind of top themes and questions that were arising from that each day. And that really helped with kind of steering the questions. And it might have been, vaccines one day, it might have been hydroxychloroquine the next. But it was really good to kind of have to be hearing from people what they wanted to know. And I think that probably led to some of that, a bit of a virtuous circle of answering the questions that people were asking. And that kind of helped with the rise in numbers that we saw as well.
Excellent. We'll quickly go to the questions from our ASC members who are also our audience. They've already sent through their questions, so they're right in front of me. Once we're done with these questions, if someone has any other questions there, feel free to type those questions in the Q&A section, and I'll have a look and see if we get time for those. So the first question is from Daisy. What's your process for review and selection of the signs that you and your team will create the content about? So I think this is a more generic question, not in the recent.
Yeah. So I'd say a few things on this. It's probably might be frustrating to hear, but I don't think there's a massive system to the way that we assess and choose which stories we tell, because like lots of things, it's probably a little idiosyncratic and quite personal in some ways. In terms of what types of sort of science or research or stories we're looking for, they have to be great stories is probably the first one, right? Like we need to find something that probably we personally, whoever the journalist or the program maker is that's doing the work, it helps if you're kind of personally excited and interested in as a story to tell, and everyone has their own quirks and favorite sort of ideas in that way. But I guess we do a lot of storytelling, like lots of the people on the call will, and so we have a pretty good understanding of what makes for a good story, we think, for whatever audience it is that we're making it for. But we also would like to think that it's not, odd, I was going to say fringe science, but there's lots of problems with disregarding mavericks or fringe science in the long run. Maybe that's the real deal, but at the same time you don't want to massively over amplify a view that's not supported by much evidence at all. So we definitely also have an element of responsibility in trying to reflect broadly what the kind of weight of evidence is on a particular question or a topic. And usually in terms of kind of mechanism, when we're working on a story, there's that commonly cited practice in science journalism of trying to get a second opinion, sometimes more, sometimes third and fourth opinions. And that is something that we often do. I wouldn't say it's a hard and fast rule, but especially if we're picking up a story on a controversial topic, we don't just like to take the word of whoever's done the study or written the paper. We'll try and talk to someone else in the field as well. And we may or may not quote them in the ultimate story, but we try and sort of take the temperature a little bit on how out there or surprising or expected this result might be. And the other thing I would say is it's definitely the hardest part of the job is choosing the stories. And I don't get to do as much reporting these days because I have to run the team. But back when I was a reporter at the BBC, I distinctly remember by far the hardest part of the job was sitting there with all of the journal abstracts that have come out this week and all of the emails that are in your inbox, which is, overflowing, and just, deciding on the story. And I would sometimes go to my editor there and say, look, I've got it down to 2. I've got this one and I've got this one. Which do you want? Basically because I couldn't make a decision anymore. And he would often look at me and go, well, which one do you want to do? And I'm like, be an editor, make a decision. And I have to try and stop myself doing the same thing with my team sometimes. But once you've picked the story, nearly every story you pick, there'll be something really good in it. But genuinely, sometimes because you're spoiled for choice and sometimes maybe for other reasons, making a decision on what to cover is the hardest part of the job.
Would you be more biased towards something that's neuroscience based, or that's your area of expertise?
It's a good question, and I don't think so. I've not done loads of brain stories since I stopped being a brain scientist. I've done some, and I think the background I had helped me in some ways on some stories back at the BBC. There was this big project, the Human Brain Project was underway. It was like a massive, expensive sort of European funded initiative that claimed to be like the Human Genome Project, but for the brain, which was a slightly flawed comparison, I thought. But knowing some context and knowing a little bit about the people involved, that kind of helped me do some coverage of that project that wasn't just, towing the party line or saying gee whiz back at the BBC. But other than that slightly inside baseball stuff, I don't think my background in neuroscience particularly helped me with covering, neuroscience stories well, or with even really wanting to. I think sometimes the fact that you know more about it doesn't help you with telling the story, because you try and add too much detail because you think it's all interesting. Whereas if you come with a slightly fresher eye, you leave out more stuff, because you can see that from the perspective of someone hearing the story, this is the bit you want to get to, and we only need these 2 or 3 details along the way to get to the cool bit.
Yeah, that's it. We've got the next question from Claire. Does ABC Science do webinars or podcasts? Which I think you partly answered, and why?
Yeah, we do loads of podcasts, and I could try and list them for you, but I won't, because I'll definitely leave one out. But all of the programs that are on Radio National about science and health all come from my team, and they are all available as podcasts as well. And then we have some pods that are dedicated, sort of digital only. The ones that spring to mind are Sum of All Parts, made by Joel Werner, and Cosmic Vertigo, although we haven't made any Cosmic Vertigos for a while. On Great Moments in Science with Dr. Carl, but that's on pause because pandemic. So loads of podcasts. Webinars, I don't think we've run any ourselves, but much like today, people on the team are often involved in other people's webinars, and I think that's an important thing for us to do, actually, is to get out and meet people and not just sit in a office or a lounge room and, you know, put stuff out there.
Contribute and collaborate. Exactly,
yeah. One of my, and not necessarily through, I mean, webinars is obviously how anything would happen now if you wanted to run an event, but one of my favorite things I've done since I came out and took the job running a unit is Occam's Razor, which is a long-running program and podcast on Radio National, which is basically a sort of a sciencey soapbox where people get 10 minutes or so to articulate an argument or an idea or tell a story. Had previously been done in the studio, and I was like, I want it to be an actual soapbox, and we'll take it out and run it as events and do it around the country. And those events have been really fun. I'm sure some of you may have come along or even helped us stage the events. And that I was a little, I think hairs were standing up on my neck the first time we ran one of those, and I went along. But they've been wonderful, and I hope sooner or later we can run events again. And the best thing about it was being in a room where you can see the audience and talk to them and actually get out and, meet some of the audience as well and hear from them, as well as, sitting behind a microphone and trying to talk to them.
That's right. Got a question from Lisa. What impact do you think the current budget cuts will have on science coverage from the ABC?
I don't know, is the short answer. My team, and in fact Radio National as a whole, so far is yet to lose any people in this round of cuts, but they're not finished. So of the redundancies that were announced last week, there are some in, like, quite a few in different divisions of the ABC, and they include some in our division. They haven't specifically been assigned to Radio National yet, but if you added up those numbers and then you read the overall statement that we are expecting to lose up to 250 people, the numbers we've heard so far don't get to 250. So they're still working out where they're going to make all of the savings. And that will include a voluntary redundancy process, which is only closing, I think, today. People can make an expression of interest in a voluntary redundancy, and then they're going to take all that on board, work out how they can best accommodate the savings they need to make, and people who have expressed an interest in going, compared to the people that, they've sort of already tried to, or the areas they've already tried to identify savings in. So it's ongoing. So personally, I don't know whether my team will be affected. Generally, I think ABC coverage will be affected as a whole. Science specifically, we'll keep going as best we can and see where we end up. But my team's pretty determined to plow on and do the best we can. In the news division, I think they have made some cuts that might make things harder, but there's any kind of specific dedicated specialists, and there's only really 2. There's Sophie Scott on medical work and Mikey Slezak on science, tech and environment. They're both still there, and I'd be surprised if, especially at the moment, if either of those were jobs that were likely to go.
Yeah. Just going back to the kind of stories we cover, how do you balance telling news stories from the big journals and publications with more local science stories? And I've added this question from our live Q&A from Lyndall, and then we'll move on to the next section of questions.
Yeah, great question, Lyndall. And I think we lean a little bit towards Aussie science stories, partly because we think it's good to tell those stories as the national broadcaster, but also because of the time zone. It's easier if there's some of the scientists involved are in the country, and we can get them on the phone without still being in the office at 10 p.m. or getting up and being there at 5. I'm sure loads of you are familiar with that problem as well. So we do keep an eye on the big journals, but for those reasons, I think we do always quite like to hear if there are Aussies involved. But it's a bit of a mix.
And this one's the last one on the pandemic. So has the pandemic in any way changed the way you or us communicate science? And what are the lessons learned or some insights that you can share with us? This question's from Dan.
I'd be interested to hear what you all think, actually, in terms of how it's changed what we do generally. I don't think, other than being pretty busy, I don't know if it's changed the way my team practices journalism. It shone a big spotlight on us, and it brought a lot of attention, and it brought a lot of company. Suddenly everyone had to be a health reporter. And I think I can see a comment about this as well, but like, who would have thought that so many people around the world would know what a preprint was in the middle of 2020? Yep. I actually sat on a panel at the World Conference of Science Journalists late last year that was talking about preprints and the issue of science journalism and covering preprints and whether that's a good idea or not, and how you should do it and how you should flag it. It felt kind of niche at the time. 8 months later, yeah, everyone's talking about preprints, and maybe I think that's amazing in some ways, because that presumably comes with some level of understanding of the fact that peer review is a thing, which might be flawed but has some value. And I think, yeah, so I think the main thing that's happened is everyone's got involved in covering science, and we've had to try and help with that, try to patch up some things that might have gone wrong. But I don't think it's really changed the way that we do, other than having been super busy and maybe trying to work super fast when the pressure was on.
It certainly changed the understanding of a layman person or a common person, or just someone not working in the science field, of them knowing terms like epidemiology or inoculum or incubation. All that was just not a common lingo that we use, and so everyone knows about it.
Yeah, a lot of awareness about some of those mechanics of science, like preprints maybe, and also just flat out biology and infectious disease epidemiology. The curve, flattening the curve, even simple things like that suddenly are household terms. I think there's a lot to reflect on that's positive about that, as well as all of the stuff that's definitely not positive, like terrifying conspiracy theories and, the sort of weird anti-science positions
that needs another Q&A.
That's a whole separate session.
Absolutely. Moving on to bushfires, we've got a question from Wesley. How easy was it to get comment on the science of bushfires when you needed it during the school holidays?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I wasn't actually kind of manning the phones, staffing the phones and trying to call people in that time, but I was working, and we were putting out stuff that, again, like if the pandemic hadn't happened, January would have been our record month for numbers, because we were writing explainers about smoke inhalation and masks, and it got into kind of mental health issues as well as the fire season wore on and just kept going. So we did a lot of work, and I don't remember hearing particular grumbles from the team about people being difficult to contact. So I think we did okay, and I think scientists were amazing at trying to make themselves available. I think if you were trying to cover like the fires themselves, that presented whole other challenges because of safety and people being involved and at risk and so on. But scientists who weren't themselves affected, I think, did a lot to help. And I think we worked pretty hard, but it was yeah, school holidays can be an issue generally, and January is often one of the worst times for that in Australia. But I think people were pretty good.
An add-on comment and then question on the conspiracy theory thing. How, even if your report wants to slam a conspiracy theory, how do you balance the need to refute the misinformation with the risks of amplifying it?
That's a huge question. And Ariel Bogle, the tech reporter on my team.
From Lyndall.
Right. So Ariel's done a lot of work on covering misinformation and is quite astute about this, and has worked with, there's other organizations out there like First Draft is a key one that are interested and involved in how we should try and tackle that stuff. And you sort of have to try and judge a threshold above which something is maybe not mainstream, but it's out there enough that it's worth addressing the misinformation, and you're not just giving it oxygen. It's kind of a fire that's worth fighting. And obviously you can't, it's not a clear line to draw, but that's definitely a consideration. It's like, how big is this? Do we need to try and tackle it? Other than that, there's lots of other things you can try and do, some of which sometimes seem impossible. One of which is the idea of pre-bunking, right? Which is before conspiracy theories start, or when they're just starting, like not mentioning them, but just doing stories that tell the way things actually are, or what the evidence says at the moment, just so that you're seeding more information out there and trying to make the ground less fertile, I guess, for those things to take hold. But it's a really difficult topic, and I think if you're in the business of covering it, which Ariel is and does a great job, setting that kind of threshold and being astute about that is good. And then there's other kind of mechanistic things you can think about. And one that I've heard people discuss recently is the idea that even if you're doing that kind of story, you don't make the conspiracy theory the first thing you say. The first factual stuff you put into your story, like even your top line or stand first, might be hydroxychloroquine is no good for coronavirus, or whatever it is, before you get into the conspiracy theory and kind of debunking it. Like you make that the secondary thing that people get to, and start with the facts. I think that came up in a separate webinar about coronavirus coverage that was happening recently.
Yep.
So there's lots of considerations in that space, and it's a messy and complicated one.
Thank you for that. Our next question is, I guess, a topic of discussion every time a group of science communicators are in a room, and that is, in your view, what is the difference between science communication and science journalism?
Yep.
It's from Tom, and I've always been trying to draw a line. It's thin, thick. What do you think? What's your take?
You're right. This always comes up, and I don't know that I have any real pearls of wisdom on it. But I do, I view myself as a journalist, and my team do as well. And I think people can get a bit precious about this conversation, and that's probably mostly journalists being precious. And I think a lot of science journalists do, like, some of what happens in science journalism, or indeed all of it, is also science communication, depending on how you define it. But in terms of definitions, the only thing I would say about journalism, and I'm not the first to say it, is at its best, it comes with some level of critique and analysis and, accountability. It's not always the case, and maybe doesn't always have to be the case, but I don't think you can call yourself a journalist if you're not aiming to shine a light in dark places, if there are dark places there to be looked into. The best science communication doubtless also involves, rigor and fact checking and accountability and making sure that nothing is missed and that misdeeds are exposed. But I think that's if you don't view that as being part of your job, then I think that's a really important part of journalism. But like I say, I think there's definitely overlap in the Venn diagram, and you could arguably put all of science journalism within science communication, but science communication also includes some of you amazing people that work in PR or in museums or doing lots of other wonderful things, which are different. So I think, yeah, you can argue about
I think it's a
with little to gain sometimes. Yeah.
It's a subset. So journalism could be a subset of science communication, and science communication involves a lot of other skill sets. So, you know, it could be an explainer, it could be a podcast, it could be an article, it could be a program that involves scientists to be able to communicate their work. It's such a broad thing, but just drawing a line, I don't know if there's even a need.
No, I think, yeah, people might, you know, call for my head if they, you know, for saying that science journalism is a type of science communication. But I think I just yeah, I'm not all that exercised by it, but I do stand by the idea that journalism should ideally involve some degree of critique.
We're nearing nearly the end of the Q&A. We've got about 10 plus minutes. Our next question is about you. What is a normal day, like a standard day in a life of a science editor? And the question's by Melissa.
Thanks, Melissa. They really vary. And they involve a lot of meetings, to be honest. But I could rattle you through like some examples. Mondays have lots of meetings in them. So things like we are a part of Radio National, and so RN has, you know, an executive that I sit on, which has to try and review how things are going and make short, medium, and long-term plans and plan the promos that go on the station. And so we have that sort of planning to do. I'll have meetings where people from my team come together with other people around the ABC who do science, and we try and have a catch up and hear who's doing what and coordinate and share resources. I might also get pulled into meetings about big projects that the ABC is doing where my team's relevant. So there's a bit of a season of content around climate change that's happening during the second half of the year, and I'm part of those kind of planning and resource sharing meetings. And there's one kicking off next week. We've got a week of mental health content to try and help people off the back or while we're still in the middle of pandemic and lockdown look after themselves. And we've got stuff that's feeding into that. So a lot of planning, a lot of meetings, and then the stuff that you might expect an editor to do, which is more editorial. In between the meetings, I have to try and fit that in. So it might be subbing a story for the digital team. It might be answering some questions and helping one of the program teams resolve how they're going to handle a program or who they need to include in a particular story. And I also have a bit of a role as science editor for the ABC more widely. So every now and then I might also get asked to consult on a big story for the TV news or whatever it might be, where they just want a steer on a particular science topic. So it's a bit of everything, and the days vary. And the most fun ones are Thursday and Friday, when somewhere between all of that, I still get to do a little bit of reporting. I have my Friday morning spot on RN Breakfast where I talk to Fran or Hamish. It was Geraldine this morning about some science news of the week. So on Thursday, I get to pick my story for that. And normally late Thursday evening, I jot down some notes and send them a script. And that's my Friday morning activity. And that's a high point of the week for sure. So,
Jonathan, what in the last 3 years or 3+ years you've been here in this organization, what have you been most proud of within the ABC Science team? What's the project or thing that you're just most excited about that you did?
I can't pick a favorite, but I could name a few things. I've already mentioned one. So I think the sort of transformation we brought to Occam's Razor and kicking off those events was really satisfying and went better than I could have imagined. We did a 4-part series that was a collaboration with the BBC early last year, called The Chase, which was lots of stories, kind of adventure stories starring scientists, was the pitch. And I got to make one of those, which is really fun, but also that kind of the overarching idea of that series was one that I kind of came up with and steered, and then we executed it. And I was really proud. We had radio sort of podcast, half-hour shows for each. We had quite elaborate digital stories for each, several of which were kind of interactives, and we had short-form videos for each. So that was quite a intense project that we took a lot of pride in, and I was really pleased with the outcome. abc.net.au/thechase if you want to check it out. But I probably, looking back, from here, really can't go past the coronavirus period, because although no one sat down in a marketing meeting and planned it as a collaborative content initiative, it's brought more eyeballs and attention to the ABC and to the work of people like the ones in my team than anything anyone could have dreamed up in a marketing meeting. And I think I'm really proud of the work that my team's done, and I think they've made a real difference. From Norman and Tegan on the podcast to the science show, health report, the whole lot, and the digital team. There's actually a story that's just gone up today. I tweeted it earlier, which is a bit of a behind-the-scenes look at how the team's been working during the pandemic, and it just made me really proud to read. It's by Susanna Lyons.
Excellent. Got a bit of a technical query here. So, what does ABC use to record live interviews for their radio and video distribution? It's from Tom.
So when we're able to get into the building, we have the luxury of very well equipped radio studios and lots of software. That's some of it's in-house and some of it's commercial to record that kind of stuff. I think you're probably asking about how we've been working it during the pandemic, which has been a whole separate challenge. Most people on the radio team have a recorder, which might be a Zoom, it might be a sound devices, it might be a Marantz. And we've just been finding ways to plug those in and record the presenters while they are having a conversation, with someone that they are interviewing, which might be on a Zoom call like this, or it might be just on the phone, and trying to either record the output of the call into the same device, or, and this is a fail-safe and a great hack if you're ever trying to do, record your own podcasts, just do what's called a tape sync. So you get the other, you have to have some device that's having the conversation, like the Zoom call or the phone call, whatever it is. But if you each at either end are just recording yourselves, and these days that's really easy, you just get your interview subject to have a second device like an iPhone that just records themselves on a voice memo. They can email that to you afterwards, and all you need is some sort of audio software where you can line up the tracks afterwards. And you don't have to use the often compromised audio quality from the Skype call or whatever it is. You just put it all together afterwards, which adds a layer of processing, but it's an excellent fail-safe that has saved us on many occasions.
We've moved on to our live questions. We've got a couple of them. So how do you balance telling news stories from the big journals and publication of more local science stories? How do you balance it out? It's from Lyndall as well.
I think we kind of did that one before. I think I waffled about time zones a bit, and it's just, I think we try to do both. And if anything, I'm a bit, I worked in science, and I know that impact factor is a bit of a tyranny and has problems. So I'm quite keen to try and cover stories that aren't necessarily from the big journals sometimes, but I'm also aware that we are still in a place where that is where, most scientists will still try and get their stuff published in those big journals, and it does normally mean something if it gets into the Lancet or whatever the kind of big name journal might be. So yeah, a bit of both.
So there was an article online a couple of weeks ago, or I think a few days ago, about tweeting new research and then it getting picked by reporters or, science communication bodies. What do you think about it? Do you look at Twitter? And would you source your news story from Twitter?
Not purely, but I definitely would use it for sure. And I don't think there's only a few times in my life, but it has happened where I've actually sourced, like a story started with a tweet that I spotted. But quite often, and again, this is something that I think even some people who aren't specialists, health and science reporters, are doing now. You can take the temperature of a story on Twitter these days, especially if it's on a topic that everyone's talking about, like COVID-19. So lots of us, including people on my team, have developed lists of people. And if you kind of want to know what people are making of this latest retraction or this latest remdesivir publication by press release, you can kind of get a sense of what the nerd gossip is on it by checking in on Twitter. And that can be really, really handy. I think most of us have steered away from Twitter as being a distribution platform because it's not growing in the same way that, say, Instagram is. It doesn't have the same number of people on it, certainly of the kind of broader population as Facebook does, but it's got lots of journalists on it and it's got lots of
Yep.
scientists on it. So if you're a
Yep.
science journalist, it's quite a good place to be, both to kind of represent our own brand and also to kind of be involved in the conversation.
Yeah, that's I completely agree with it. I think there's a lot of people who have a voice, who want to say, who want to interact. They're all there on Twitter, and if they're not, then their peers and colleagues bring them on at some stage in their careers. So
Yeah.
that helps. Just with the pandemic again, the way science is being perceived by the society, by people, by the bureaucracy, by politics, by everyone in general. Obviously, it's happened quite a lot in the last 6 months with the fires, with all the climate change issues that we've been dealing with, and then the pandemic. How can we build on it? And this question's from Sharon. How do we build on this?
Oh, that's a great question, Sharon. I think that you're definitely right. There is something we can build on, and I think it's up to all of us to try and do that, because there has been a lot of attention paid to science that maybe wasn't previously, and most of it's been positive. There's been some of that weirdness around the edges, but I think the vast majority of it has been coming to scientists, science communicators, science journalists, and places like the ABC for answers to difficult questions. I think we have to be careful. I think we have to be honest about what we know and what we don't know. And that's been a big theme in some of our coverage of the coronavirus, because it's so new and there's a lot that we don't know. And trying to help people understand uncertainty, trying to help people understand risk. I hate the word safe. I hate being asked whether or not this is safe. It's like, that whole understanding of risk. And especially now we're mostly coming out of lockdown and people have to make their own decisions about the level of risk that they're happy with. I think we've all got a job to do to try and help people know a bit about how the virus works and make their decisions about what they think is too risky and what they're happy with. So I think it's a fantastic opportunity. And as you mentioned, with politics as well, there's been experts providing briefings to government. Some of those have been public. My wife works in the science policy space, and it's been really interesting to see all that happening. So I really hope we can build on that and continue to help scientists inform policy, inform the public in how they do things. And yeah, I'm interested to see. I can't say I've got any insight into exactly how we build on it and what we put in place, but I would love to see what happens. And we have to be mindful of the opportunity we've got and try not to blow it, I think.
Excellent. Sounds very, very good. Thank you, Jonathan, for your time and for sharing all this information, ideas, and enlightening us with all the insights. We did get a few more questions, but I guess we can carry on with those questions on Twitter if you're happy to just type away. And thank you to all our attendees, all 23 of you, to be with us and to be sharing this time with us. Follow us on Australian Science Communicators. It's AU Scicomm. The local Twitter is ASC New South Wales. And also encourage your colleagues and peers to join the Australian Science Communicator membership. Thank you again, everyone. And thanks a lot, Jonathan.
Cheers, Astha. Thanks a lot. Thanks all.
Good one, everyone. Bye.